Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another sermon here at Nazarene Way Church. If you are new here, we are restoring the original movement, the original Judean Hebraic sect that Jesus started. The movement really that Jesus really started, and it kind of started a little bit before him with John the Baptist and potentially John the Essene. And we are here to restore the way, the true way, the Nazarene way. Jesus and his disciples that actually knew him, that walked with him, they refer to themselves internally as disciples of the way or people of the way, and you can find that in the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles. And externally, they were known as the Nazarenes, a sect, not named after Nazareth, which there is much debate on whether Nazareth even existed at the time. These were Galilean, Hebraic, Judean individuals, Israelites, that called themselves the Nazarenes. And the term Nazarene stems from the term netzer, which means to branch off, just like the root of David, to branch off. And that's where the term Nazarite comes from as well. Anyway, we are here to restore the original, purest religion that Jesus followed, that his disciples followed, and that everyone besides the man who invented Christianity followed. And the man who invented Christianity is a man by the name of Paul of Tarsus. And I don't think Paul of Tarsus was necessarily an insidious individual who meant evil. However, we do have evidence that he was clearly a grandiose narcissist. What happened is Paul's gospel, Paul's teachings, and Paul is a man who never knew Jesus, never met Jesus. 7 years after the death of Jesus, claims that he saw an apparition, a white light, and claims that that was Jesus. Just basically, he has the same claimant to knowing Jesus as Muhammad has, as Joseph Smith has. And therefore, what we are doing is we are forking back the original religion back to the sect of the Nazarenes. And you can read all about the Nazarenes if you read the church father Epiphanius talk about the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, and we know a lot about them. We know about them thanks to individuals like the patristics, meaning the church fathers, raging against them and calling them heretics, which is quite paradoxical because he's basically calling the original sect and religion of Jesus heresy. And later they became known as the Orthodox Christians or the Catholics. Anyway, you have entered at a phenomenal, fantastic time. We are in our digital synagogue phase, our digital assembly phase, and we're going to be rolling out into a house church where other people in Southern California can come attend, and then we're going to be getting an IRL massive church at some point in the future as well. So wherever you are in the world, welcome. Shabbat Shalom. We celebrate the exact same holidays, the exact same celebrations that Jesus celebrated, and every Friday night till Saturday night, they sat down as a family. Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. And you have to picture this. Picture the aroma of the bread, in the air, in the home. And Jesus talking about certain scripture, breaking bread, discussing with his brother James, James the Just, and that type of environment held every Friday night, which that exact type of environment, that practice has been completely wiped from the religion of Christianity, right? The Roman pagan cult religion of Christianity. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. Stay tuned because what we have in store for you today is a fantastic sermon all about one thing. We're going to talk about what do the Catholics think about Jesus having siblings. And before we get into it, I want to start by saying, hey, I'm a recovering Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. And I think there are a lot of recovering Catholics, meaning people who, really wanted the best, wanted to believe in Jesus, yet they would attend Mass. They would attend these rituals. They would attend these Roman pagan cultic Mass rituals with incense, with many gods and many idols and many saints. There's over 5,000 saints. People would pray to them. They would pray to the rosary. And they would think to themselves, wait, this seems like the exact opposite of what Jesus preached. And so if that describes you, I'm preaching to you because I was once in your shoes. And in fact, many people struggle because they go to, the Catholic Church with well-intentioned or the Christian Church, yet the only thing that is not read, that is not followed, are the words and actions and the movement that Yeshua, the Nazarene, aka Yeshua is the Aramaic name that Jesus actually went by, And in Greek, it got essentially transliterated into Jesus, or then later on from the Greek Jesus to Jesus in English. Anyway, Yeshua the Nazarene and his religion. If he came back today, he would have no idea what the heck, this whole Roman pagan cultic Catholicism religion is. And we are here to restore the way, capitalized way, because they use the term way to restore the way of life. And you can read about that in the Didache. Okay, let's keep going here. So, the question is, what do Catholics think about, the idea that Jesus had siblings, meaning he had 4 brothers and 2 sisters? Well, it's quite interesting, because I grew up in the Catholic Church. I actually grew up going to the Episcopal Church, and then the Catholic Church, and then Christian Church. And you're taught to read the Gospels, and you're taught to study, the Word of God, right? You're taught to study Jesus and what he did. Yet there in the very beginning of Mark, the shortest Gospel, and the one that scholars think is the one that was the first written Gospel, we find in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, a roster of Jesus' 4 brothers. And that is James, Joseph, which is also known as Joseph, and Judas, and Simon. And some scholars, like James Tabor, thinks that Simon also is Simon the Zealot. Now let's talk about this. We've got James the Just. He is the ringleader. He is the one that essentially carried the torch forward after the death of Jesus. And you can look him up. He became known as James the Just. And he was the central person of the 3 pillars of Jerusalem. And you can read about Paul talking about the 3 pillars of Jerusalem. James, his hand man Cephas, which is named Peter, also known as Peter, and then John the Apostle. Those were the 3 pillars, led by James the Just, the brother of Jesus. Then there was Joseph. We don't really know much about Joseph, which is really interesting. Joseph is actually, the transliteration is Joseph, so he was probably named after, his father, Joseph. And then there was Judas. And Judas actually, they had a whole rebranding of Judas because they don't want him to get essentially confused with Judas Iscariot. And so they named him, and the Catholics named him Jude. And you can find the book and the epistle of Jude hidden in the back of the New Testament. That is, people don't talk about that. And what's interesting is in Jude, I believe he quotes the book of Enoch, which is also not included in the canonical New Testament. So you have Jude, the brother of Jesus, hidden in plain sight, that quotes the book of Enoch, which the Catholics in the 4th century, a bunch of bishops and Roman pagan white-haired old men got together in a council and decided, hey, no, we don't want the book of Enoch in the canonical Bible, which is kind of odd because Jesus' biological brother quotes from it. And then we've got Simon, which is Simon the Zealot. And some people think that this could also potentially be Simeon of Cleophas, who was also carried forward the Nazarene movement after the death of Jesus, and James and Jude. So Mark 6:3 not only mentions the names of the 4 brothers, it also mentions Jesus' sisters as well, and there are at least 2 sisters. And there are also multiple gospel attestations for this. The roster of these individuals are also listed in John. I believe they are also listed in Matthew. They are just hidden in plain sight. And there's early evidence of this. The early evidence of this is, Paul's letters, ironically, are some of the earliest letters that we have, written around the 50s CE in the 1st century. And Paul refers to them as brothers of the Lord. Josephus, an individual, a historian, that was essentially hired by and given essentially a stipend every single month to just go to the library and recite and report history. Josephus was an individual that was completely completely independent, completely unbiased. In fact, he had a bias against, reporting on the Christians, right? And he describes James as the brother of Jesus. It was a well-known fact. And Josephus is one of the most reliable scholars that we have in the first century in the Roman Judean area in that field. And then we have what is called the Jewish Christian Hegesippus, who unfortunately his documents, his writings, his manuscripts, his diaries, they have been lost, they've been burned. I wonder why. Conspiracy. And I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy, but when you see the same trend popping up, it's not just coincidence. You start to realize, hey, maybe there was a cover-up. Maybe not in the last few hundred years, but certainly potentially in the 4th century, the 5th century, especially during the Crusades, when people were extremely dogmatic. And anyway, Hegesippus, unfortunately, his works are lost, but thankfully, there's this church historian that the Catholics rely on for their church history, a man named Eusebius. And Eusebius quotes and preserves the passages, in some passages, of Hegesippus's journals, because Hegesippus was so close to and knew personally many of the disciples. And guess what? Hegesippus refers to Judas as Jesus' brother. There are also multiple independent sources confirming this. Now, there is something, and if you're a Catholic tuning into this and, rage commenting already in the comment section, then you already know about this. There's something in Catholicism called the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And the abbreviation, whenever people refer to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, they use CCC. And it's kind of like a list of dogmatic beliefs that the Catholics believe without question are beliefs that were divinely inspired and divinely given and are uncompromisable truths. They are something that the Catholics believe in. And so what you will find is, if you study or read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, is you will find all of their claims and all of their positions on many different things. Well, if we turn to CCC, meaning the Catechism 499, we find the paragraph declaring that Mary is ever virgin, that she was, a virgin before, a virgin during, and a virgin after the birth of Jesus. This is a concept I've talked about in some of my previous sermons, and the concept is known as Mary's perpetual virginity. You see, Catholics believe, according to the CCC 499, that Mary's hymen, literally they say this, it's pretty explicit and kind of grotesque when you put it in these terms, but Mary's hymen was intact, meaning was preserved after the death of Jesus, and remained intact over the course of her entire life. Meaning Joseph, a man who, married this young wife, who, were told by this mythological belief, and we're told and taught that, okay, this young wife had a baby, and it wasn't mine, apparently. She was impregnated by the Holy Spirit, and she had the baby, right? And then after that, Joseph is supposed to just never make love to his wife. And that's what we're expected to believe. That's what we're taught to believe. Chances are, if you were brainwashed into Catholicism at a young age before you could think, just like I was, you probably tried to defend that because it was beat into your mind and beat into your head so many times. Now, there's a few problems with this idea and with this belief. First and foremost, we have evidence, thanks to the psychopath named Epiphanius, who is a church father and historian, who wrote a rampage listing about 80 heresies. We know from him that the Nazarenes, meaning Jesus' disciples, and the offspring of his disciples, meaning the descendants of the disciples, and the later group, which the disciples became known as, is the Ebionim, which means the poor ones, because they absconded wealth. We know from Epiphanius that, well, the Nazarenes and the Ebionim, the descendants of the disciples and the followers of this movement, used the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. Potentially, maybe even an earlier version of Matthew, which I have right here. This is a I believe this is a 13th century discovery of a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. It's not the original one that the Ebionites and the Nazarenes used. But what we do know about this is that they used a version of the Gospel of Matthew, but their version did not have the first 2 chapters. And what do we find in the first 2 chapters? We find that whole virgin birth narrative invented, the mythological narrative of Mary, of her being a virgin, of her having a virgin birth. The Nazarenes did not believe in that. They did not believe in the virgin birth, even though there was a misreading and a misinterpretation by Jerome that they thought the Nazarenes did believe in the virgin birth and the Ebionites didn't. And thanks to that, and thanks to some bad scholarship and citation, if you go and look up the Nazarene sect on Wikipedia, you find that mistaken belief as well. But the fact is that the Nazarenes and the Ebionim, they did not believe in the virgin birth. They did not even have the first 2 chapters in Matthew because that was prepended on later on by a misreading of the book of Isaiah 7:14, which was a young maiden is supposed to be giving birth to the Messiah, which was speaking of, I believe the prophet was Emmanuel. It was taken out of context. And someone read this and said, hey, wait, the Messiah, which means the anointed one, the Messiah is supposed to be born of a virgin. Well, the problem with that is that the Hebrew version of that doesn't say that. The Hebrew version says young maiden. Yet when it was transliterated and translated into Greek, some scribe misinterpreted it and wrote young virgin, which is quite funny. So they invented this whole virgin birth narrative. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 with this whole concept of the virgin birth is that it actually, this idea of Mary's hymen being intact and Mary being a perpetual virgin throughout her entire life, comes from a text known as the Proto-Evangelium of James. And the problem is that the Proto-Evangelium of James is not in the canon. It is quote-unquote apocryphal. It is an apocryphal text. So the great irony is this, is that here we have it. Catechism CCC 499, they have adopted this apocryphal text, this apocryphal belief in the virgin birth and in the perpetual virginity of Mary, and they've cherry-picked it and said, yes, we believe in that, but here is something in our canon, in our Bible, which clearly says Jesus, through Mary, had other siblings, had 4 other brothers, 2 other sisters, and in the first 300 years after the death of Jesus, this was reported by Paul, by the church fathers, by Eusebius, by Hegesippus, by Josephus, who is an external, not even associated with the movement, and completely unbiased, and many of the other patristics and church fathers, up until the 4th century, at one of the councils, which a bunch of bishops got together with white hair and said, no, we have to declare and put Mary up here on a pedestal and make her completely holy. How do we do that? Well, we need to make sure that no one has ever penetrated her and had sex with her, not even Joseph, who we've kind of written out of the picture. So when you actually start to study this stuff and open your eyes, you start to piece together the true human, the true love of Jesus, who he was, and Mary. They've taken Mary's actual hardship, beautiful life, and written it out into this weird Roman pagan cultic deity figure. Because at the time, with the pantheon, with all the Greek gods, it was much easier, much more interesting to tell stories around the table of some virgin birth story. And it caught on like wildfire. And before we go any further, side note, there is a fantastic book that James Tabor just released on Mary, and it's called The Lost Mary, and rediscovering the actual true Mary, which is really fascinating. Okay, next we have this. We have the next catechism, which is Catechism, it's CCC 500. It sounds like, I don't know, this some type of the CCC 500. Yeah. The CCC 500. Okay. Yeah, sounds like a motocross bike or something. Anyway, the CCC 500 is a catechism, a dogmatic belief by the Catholics that was invented, hundreds or even thousands of years after the death of Jesus, in which they state that the Bible mentions the brothers and sisters of Jesus, but the Catholic Church interprets them as not children of Mary. James and Joseph, they say, are said to be sons of another Mary. And they try to do a lot of hand waving, and they create this extremely limp straw man as their excuse for what they believe and why they believe it. When in all of the Gospels, especially Mark 6:3, the first one written, and even Paul, the roster of Jesus' brothers is stated there in plain sight. So, why this doctrine? Well, as I've just covered and mentioned, the elevation of Mary in later theology was something that just caught on. People loved the idea of her being almost like a Greek goddess, a Roman pagan cultic goddess. And it was influenced from, like I said, the Proto-Evangelium of James. And the Roman era preference was very clear. They preferred divine figures. They preferred amazing mythological stories. Even Caesar was declared as divine, 100% man and 100% God. They loved telling tales around their festivals, their winter solstices, their oasters, which turned into Easter, the Roman pagan cult called Easter, which was, invented and ensconced into Catholicism. And, the winter solstice, right? And Ol Yule, which was ensconced into the Roman pagan cultic holiday of Christmas, which is coming up. So I talked about that last week. It's important for us to really not look at the modern day secular holidays as if they are sacred holidays that Jesus celebrated, because they weren't. Celebrate them all you want, but celebrate the exact same holidays that Jesus celebrated. Anyway, the dogma was fixed, in all this stuff by the late 4th century councils, the Council of Nicaea. There was many different councils that were more than Nicaea and more than the Nicene Creed, which if you're Catholic, you had the Nicene Creed hammered into your head from a very young age. You get up there and you solemnly declare and chant with the rest of the cult members that I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, the Creator of heaven and earth. I believe in the three God system called the Trinity, and I'm supposed to do some logical leap and believe that is still one God, even though you've just listed three separate entities that are separate gods. And you just go through that, right? That was in the 4th century, the Nicene Creed. Okay, so let's move on. I want to talk to you about this. I'm reading this book right now. It is called A Marginal Jew. And it is written by John P. Meyer. Now, a marginal Jew, what that means is, when you think about Jesus' life and his brothers, this was a completely poor group of Hebrews, a small family of Hebrews, outside of, I believe it's Sepphoris, which was burned to the ground, before Jesus was born. He came from the Galilee region, a very, very poor region. His father was a tekton. Joseph was called a tekton, which, that's where the term technology comes from. Using tools, technology, a day laborer, someone that probably built homes, houses, not a carpenter, that's like a myth, a tekton, right? And Jesus came from this very extremely poor family. He was essentially, if you open a book, and here's the main content, Jesus lived in the margins. He was a marginal Jew. And it's really quite phenomenal that we have this marginal Jew 2,000 years ago who became literally the most famous human being in human history. You think of the 8 billion people on this planet Earth, 99% of them know who Jesus is. John P. Meyer wrote A Marginal Jew. I am reading it right now. I first heard about this book while reading Reza Aslan's fantastic book called Zealot. Now, I was reading Zealot, and I've read it twice, and I read through all of the footnotes twice, and I kept seeing one reference come up over and over again, and it was a book by John P. Meyer called A Marginal Jew. And in reading more about this, Reza Aslan cited in